Hey, Christine. My name is Justin. Welcome to the Geekcentric podcast. How are you doing today?
Very good. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm absolutely excited to chat with you about your role on Loki, being costume designer for the latest season. Because one of my favorite parts of the show from season one to season two is the world of the TVA. And that is so beautifully represented and captured in the production design and the costume design. So I wanted to know, how did you collaborate with the production design team to ensure that the costumes in Loki aligned with this retro futuristic style of the series, creating a very cohesive and visually consistent world for the audience?
Well, I think you nailed it. It was a collaboration and it started with the pages, with the script, Michael Waldron footprint with Mad Men meets Blade Runner. And Kasra and I definitely spent a lot of time together and going over things together. And incredibly, same with the director. We had a lot of similar references. I just remember one of the very first meetings, all of us are heavy research people and love
Right.
love a lot of reference, and we all had Brazil in our reference boards. And I think
Interesting.
right, and we all had a love of analog and trying to be as practical as possible and trying to let the characters really come through. And I think Kazra and I just talking about the color palette and being very connected that way. I think it really allowed. I think it allowed the audience to really sink into the world.
Yeah,
So.
absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It was, again, one of the things that I absolutely adore about this series is the consistency with that and the commitment and the intent, from the color palettes to the production design to the way the costumes just, there's such a marriage between the two that helps bring this world to life, and it's just done so well. Now I did read that that I believe Ki Kwan actually had some input on his costume this time around as OB. Is that true?
He really did want to be able to explore patches. We designed so many, so fun to have that resource of designing so many different patches kind of based in that uh early mid-century
Mhm.
vibe. Um, I mean, we didn't obviously get to use them all, but it
Right.
was a little a nod to Key.
Well, I
Yes.
I wanted to ask in regards to that, like, were there any other actors or any other performers that had some input on their costume, and do you, how do you find a way to kind of collaborate with them as well to kind of, still keep the consistency of the overall vision?
I think the beauty of working on these Marvel projects, or actually just doing your due diligence as a costume designer, is really creating a world in illustrations and reference boards. And when you walk into those first fittings or a conversation with such talented actors, it really gives you a launching pad to
Mhm.
start from and grow from or stay within. And I think it depends on the actor. Like it can expand the vision or it can help to like hone in the vision. But I definitely uh think, and what makes it so lovely is it can only be collaborative, and
Of
that's really
course.
lovely.
Yeah, no, that's the best part, right? Of that. Did you have a specific era that you really enjoyed? Because we see a bunch of different timelines in this iteration of season two. Is there one that you really had fun with in terms of designing for costumes?
Um, I had fun with all of them,
Okay.
to tell you the truth. I mean, it was really great because Kasra directed the 3rd episode,
Mhm.
so to collaborate with him as a director was really fun, and those clothes are, um, incredible to do in England, for one thing,
Mhm.
when you're shooting in England, because the fabrics and your resources are so, deep, right?
Mhm.
But I also love doing the '70s because I thought that the '70s was such a nice quick transition out of the TVA. It just felt so different, so much more glamorous, shall we say, than the TVA.
For sure, for sure. And you nailed the McDonald's. Like, the outfits were fantastic in those. So I
Thank
loved
you.
them. Um, my last question as we wrap here, I wanted to know if you had your own temp pad and you could travel anywhere and just maybe even vacation, just like, you want to pop in there, and I'd love to know where you'd like to go, especially given the background as a costume designer. I'd love to know.
Okay, so we're gonna say a place and a time?
Sure.
Okay, I would love to have done, like, the swinging '60s in London. Like, there's so much art, music, and talent that came out of that.
There's a big boom at that point too, right? From fashion, from art, from
Oh,
music, and
that's so
yeah,
fun, and they're all colliding along with, like, a beatnik culture, and so many, and yeah,
that's awesome. Well, thank you again, Christine, for joining us on the Geekcentric podcast. It really means a lot. I love your work, and I can't wait to see what you do next.
thank you.
How are you doing today?
Very well, Justin. Thank you for your interest.
Well, thank you for joining this podcast, because honestly, you directed episode 3, and it is my favorite of the 4 episodes that I was able to preview, just because of how timely it was. Now, a lot of people might not know this, or they do know this, but you started out as a production designer, and specifically, you were the production designer on Loki season 1. So a lot of that world building of the TVA came from you and your team, which is probably one of the most consistent parts from season 1 to season 2, just so immersive. But with that said, I wanted to know what inspired you to step into the director's role for this episode, and how did your background in production design sort of influence your approach to directing this episode?
Thank you. Yeah, you know what? I mean, this is like a dream job to production design this show. Like if
Yeah.
for somebody like myself who's a fan of design, proper like architectural design, and I love genre design, but what I loved about Loki is it was an opportunity to really stretch our legs and flex our muscles in the like real design world in terms of architectural design. And I think it's why we are able to carve out a kind of a new feeling within the MCU. So no, it was an absolute joy to do. And in terms of directing, it's something I've always wanted to do. I've had occasion to do it a few times in the past. And in this context, it made so much sense after designing the first season, um, and how collaborative the team is, led by Kevin Wright and Michelle Blood on our show. They're just very inclusive, and the writers on season 1, Michael Waldron and his team, and on season 2, Eric Martin, who included me into the writers' room. Just a very collaborative, interactive process between the world building that we do in the design side of it and the world building that's done with the characters in the script. So I felt like I was kind of embedded in, and so it seemed natural, I guess, and I was gratified that Kevin suggested I do one.
Yeah, it sounds like you had a relationship with everyone. You had been working on this project, and it was just so comfortable to jump into this role. And you can see that from the way this episode very much rolls. It's just everything is so confident, and that can be said about the entire series for sure. Now, this episode, we are introduced to another variant of Kang, and I
Yeah,
wanted to know, in your own words, how
yeah.
do you believe Victor Timely's character distinguishes himself different from the other Kang variants? And how do you feel this episode sort of captures telling that story?
Sure. I mean, I feel like we're all a product of nature and nurture, right? And so you've got your genes that define 50% of who you're going to be, and then the other 50%, which is a lot, is about circumstance and about when and where you were born, and who it is that's teaching you and showing you things along the way. So I think there's potential to be wildly different outcomes from the different variants. And I think that what we're seeing in this episode, without getting too far ahead of the episode, is that
Mhm.
like this is not obviously um what they were expecting necessarily, and
Mhm.
this is a very really different person. And I think that what we're seeing is like a brilliant, quirky inventor who was born at placed in time and born at a moment where he's ahead of the culture in which he exists, and that was kind of exacerbated by the fact that Renslayer and Miss Minutes give him this like super critical piece of technological knowledge in his, you know, adolescence, basically. And we check back in with him 25 years later and see how that's played out. And I think that like this Victor Timely for me was, you know, a reference that we discussed a lot, was Granville Woods, who's an African-American inventor from the mid 19th century, who was an electrical engineer, made many brilliant inventions that were constantly, you know, people were trying to take credit for them and steal them. Edison twice tried to claim inventions of his as his own and lost in court both times. Ultimately ended up offering him a job, which he turned down. So this was like a big inspiration for Victor Timely for us.
Right. Awesome. Well, you know, again, it seems like, you know, we already met He Who Remains. It feels like Victor Timely is he who started it all, sort of, you know, and in a lot of ways. And I love the inspiration and your direction with how you wanted to shape that character, because he seems like a bit of a con artist in some ways, but he's using, I think, to your point, where people might think they're taking from him or that he's at a disadvantage. He's using that to his advantage in the con. So I think that's really smart in describing it that way. Well, Kasra, thank you so much for joining us on the Geekcentric podcast. I look forward to seeing what you do next, my friend.
Thank you so much.